My name's John. I'm the owner of Proof Bread. We're an artisan bakery that happens right here in my home garage in Mesa, Arizona. Bread gets a bad reputation because we have changed it over time into something that is different from what it was historically. If you think about bread from a human history perspective, meaning the last 13,000 years, which is about as long ago as we've found artifacts of bread making, you'd find that bread was representative of a huge portion of our calories that we consumed. So up until 100 years ago, 80% of our calories came from whole grains. If you were living in the Western world, that whole grain bread that whole grain was coming in the form of bread. In other parts of the world, it would have been rice. But bread has been a staple of our diet, and whole grain bread is nutritious. However, whole grain bread is hard to come by. Bread isn't long fermented anymore. It's just changed. So along with the change that has happened in bread, you just see lower quality industrial bread, and the very definition of what happens with the bread as it enters your body is different now. Even buying the whole wheat bread at the grocery store, you're not really getting the same product that we're making here. First, the grocery store is sort of an illusion of choice when it comes to bread. If you go down the bread aisle, you see all these brands and all these choices, but if you dig a little further, you'll find that a lot of those choices are actually just one company. So over the last couple decades, you've seen a huge consolidation happen amongst industrial bread producers. Flour Foods, which is ticker symbol FLO on the New York Stock Exchange, owns so many of the brands: Sara Lee, Wonder Bread, Dave's Killer Bread, all just one company. So the bread aisle is more of an illusion of choice. You're really buying from one big corporation. The problem starts with wheat as a crop and looking at how it's grown, looking at how it's being processed all the way to the final loaf. So first off, when we're talking about big industry, the first word that comes to my mind is speed. It's a lot easier to find good margins with bread production if I can take bread from the flour dust, and make it into a sellable product in under 2 hours. And that's the reality of industrial bread, is you can go start to finish in rapid speed. So all the equipment that you see in our bakery that we have optimized for longer processes is really designed for dough that's coming directly out of the mixer, now being dumped into the bread divider and shaped right away. The process is like 30 minutes from mixer to table. What happens is that wheat needs to be fermented. Wheat itself has all of these sort of anti-nutrients in it, phytates, lectins. Gluten itself is tough and hard for our bodies to digest. And so when it comes to bread production at an industrial level, there just simply isn't the time in order for the wheat to ferment out and neutralize all of those sort of anti-nutrients and aspects of the food that's harder for our body to digest. When we change the fermentation to sourdough, we change from a 2-hour process to something that actually takes more than a day. So the time that we take from dust to final loaf is closer to 30 hours from start to finish. In that 30-hour process, the entire time fermentation's taking place. So we're dealing with a living product in our loaves of bread, and it is completely alive, chock full of microorganisms, all the way until it hits a terminal temperature in the oven, which is 135 degrees for yeast. So the bread really is alive that entire 30-hour process. During the time of fermentation, lactobacillus and the wild yeast that's in the starter is slowly eating away at the nutrients that are in the dough and changing the characteristics of the bread from this pre-fermented raw food that came from the earth to this completely new thing that's fermented. The term bioavailability comes to mind because fermentation changes the bioavailability of the bread, making nutrients easier for our body to uptake. So the whole grain loaf that you're getting from me that's been made over a 30-hour process, you have a better bioavailability of vitamin A, vitamin B, all the smaller micronutrients and minerals than you do in that bread that you're buying that's whole wheat from the store. I could go a step further and tell you that the whole wheat bread that you're buying at the store, there's a little bit of a trickery associated to it. So industrial steel mills are really, really good at stripping the wheat berry of the germ and the bran, the outer layers of the wheat berry. And what's left is just the inner layer, the endosperm, which is a starch. That creates white flour. And so industrial mills are really in the business of creating white flour. It's very predictable. But then they have this byproduct that they sifted out in the bran and the germ. So in creating whole wheat bread at an industrial scale, basically the mills are taking that byproduct that they sifted out when they created white flour and re-injecting it back to create whole wheat flour. But it's not whole wheat flour in the way that you would think. So it's a big mixing pot now of grains. So you're no longer getting the bran and the germ from the wheat berry that it was sifted out of. It's now a different batch of wheat altogether, being reformulated in a particular recipe that creates a whole wheat flour that's acceptable. All of industrial milling is creating this speck flour at the end. It's not really a representation of what's growing locally. It's not really bound by the baker's skill at the end of the day. This is all just very scientifically derived flour that predictably bakes every single time the exact same way. And so when you're buying bread like that, the artisanship is sort of gone. The living aspect of the bread is gone. So how does a modern industrial wheat farmer prevent crop failure? They spray their wheat crop with glyphosate, Roundup, desiccating the crop before it turns golden, which is a stage in wheat production where the wheat crop goes from green to gold. The product has to sort of age on the field for a longer period of time before it's ready to harvest. Right now, we're weeks away from this year's harvest, and the wheat that's in the field is starting to turn right now. This is actually the time that there's a greater risk to the wheat itself. If you don't spray that crop with a desiccant like Roundup, if it gets the right amount of moisture from heavy rainfall right now, that wheat will begin to sprout and the farmer loses their whole crop. So instead, they'll kill the crop right now with a desiccant Roundup, and then they have no trouble harvesting the entire crop in a few weeks. The way we make bread is a little different. We're in Arizona. The wheat that we buy that's grown here in this extremely dry climate, the farmers can take a risk of not desiccating it with a Roundup because they're likely going to let it turn golden in color. There's very little risk of rain right now until our monsoon starts. So the harvest has to happen before the monsoon season. All of this is stuff we're sort of aware of and have learned of because of the way in which we produce bread. Most of the general public is disconnected from all of these little nuances of information just because all this has been sort of commoditized out. The typical baker right now that's buying flour is buying from an industrial mill. If the baker is working in any kind of volume, they're getting flour by the pallet. That mill is producing flour by the thousands of pallets. All of that flour is derived from grain that is being accumulated in mass in a grain elevator, just a big silo where a bunch of people that are growing grain all get together and dump off their grain. There's no tracing that flour. So the mill's job is to turn that flour into this perfect, precise protein level and whatnot through science. But when you buy local ingredients, you can actually trace back to the field that the product was grown on. And you end up having a relationship all the way through the supply chain. This is important, especially in different times that we're dealing with as a society. I think more and more people are trying to understand where their product is coming from, where the food that they're consuming is being grown. By understanding this and by having relationships that go all the way to the seed, we can then influence the process over time. So we work with our mill, who then in turn works with the growers that are growing from them around the state to better the crop year over year, but we do so while also factoring other considerations other than what the baker wants. So we also have to be influencing the soil positively and doing all these things. By working in smaller supply chains, There's just better overall control from seed all the way to plate. And over time, we can improve the quality of our agriculture, improve the quality of our soil. Whereas when you work in this industrial global supply chain, we don't have enough skin in the game for the wheat production that's happening somewhere else in the country to even have a taste of what's going on. We don't, as a baker, have any influence over that crop that's being grown. In this context, locally, whenever there's a problem, we go directly to our mill that goes directly to their supplier. The chain is so short, and we're constantly influencing it with the work that we do. What is commercial yeast? Commercial yeast, in part, is present in our sourdough starter. So a sourdough starter is the combination of lactobacillus bacteria. It's a beneficial bacteria that helps and has a symbiotic relationship with wild yeast. Our sourdough starter's name is Harriet, and she's based here in Mesa, Arizona. So the mixture of flour and water over time creates that fermentation effect. So if you put flour and water in the right temperature, and you will eventually get a sourdough starter, if you keep feeding it and making it more robust over time, you're going to end up getting this colony of microorganisms that have the ability to leaven dough on the fly for you every single day. This is sort of an investment in a pet. That's why Harriet has a name. I have to feed Harriet all the time, whether I'm happy, sad, tired. But yeast itself, commercial yeast, is just that yeast portion of the sourdough starter that's been isolated. So scientists in the 1800s isolated commercial yeast in a laboratory for the first time, and were able to multiply it and put it in a medium that was shelf stable. So really, all that commercial yeast is this sort of shelf stable version of highly multiplied wild yeast, but highly multiplied beyond levels, orders of magnitude different. So there's a way in which to correlate. 10 grams, meaning just a spoonful of commercial yeast, is the equivalent leavening power of 50 kilos. Just in there, you can see the difference. I can sprinkle a dusting of commercial yeast and get the same result as 5 whole buckets of sourdough starter. Now, compare that to a baking process. I can sprinkle that amount of yeast into 1 croissant. I can't put 50 kilograms of sourdough starter into 1 croissant. The whole croissant only weighs 100 grams to begin with. So the amount of leavening in a sourdough croissant versus a yeasted croissant, a night and day difference. So it takes so much more effort and energy and time for that sourdough croissant to go through the right rising pattern that yeasted croissant can. So what is sourdough? Sourdough is a method. It's not a flavor. It's a method that's existed for a really long time. Before there was commercial yeast in the mid-1800s, there was people that figured out how to ferment a sourdough starter, and that just happened probably spontaneously at some point in history when people combined flour and water and let it sit for a little while and saw that it was bubbling and wondered what the heck all that bubbling was about. Over time, we figured out that if we feed this bubbling goop, that it rises some more, and if we feed bread when it's at its peak risen quality, especially if we've really thought about it more at a microbial level, tried to make sure that we're mixing bread when the maximum amount of cell colony is created in that sourdough culture, we can get a really robust leavening just from flour and water in the air that's been fermented. Bread making is actually traditional, simple, rustic, rudimentary. You can do it at scale, and to do it at scale requires graduating to that scale, requires a lot of skill, requires a lot of understanding of timing, fermentation, all that. But baking 1 or 2 loaves of bread at home is as simple as just combining 3 ingredients plus a leavening agent, which is part of those 3 ingredients: flour, water, salt. And then I have flour and water, which if I feed it and keep it at the right temperature, creates a sourdough starter. So my bread, the artisan rustic bread, is just flour, water, and salt, 3 ingredients. If you compare that to the bread that most people are used to nowadays coming from the store, You can't find a loaf of bread without 15 ingredients. And what are those? What's in there exactly? There's hardly anything whole. Yes, you get the flour and the water and the salt, and then you have to go into the flour and say it's not the same flour. Now you're dealing with bleached flour. Also, you're dealing with enriched flour. So what is enriched flour? On that industrial steel mill, the mill has stripped away the bran, it's stripped away the germ. You're left with white flour. White flour is a starch, carbohydrate, not a whole lot of nutrient density, not a whole lot of protein or natural fats. All the vitamins and minerals are also in the bran and the germ that's been sifted out of that white flour. So what do the mills do? They re-inject the white flour with chemical versions of the vitamins and minerals that you see in whole grain bread, and that is what enriched flour is. Then we go on to the actual dough itself and all the additives and things that are added to make up 15 ingredients. So let's take an apples to apples comparison. It's my sandwich bread. So we start with flour, water, and salt. That makes an artisan crusty loaf. It's soft on the inside, it's crusty on the outside. That's the bread that we've eaten historically. If we add a few extra ingredients like milk, butter, and a touch of sugar, you get a drastically different result. Now, the milk is actually going to strengthen that dough. It's going to make those gluten strands even stronger, so that the dough can take a beating and can be deflated. The water is going to be retained in the dough because of the sugar. So sugar's not in that dough as a sweetener. There's only 1.5 grams in our sandwich bread of sugar. Compare that to the actual sweetener that's in the store bread, the high fructose corn syrup. The only purpose of the high fructose corn syrup in that bread is to sweeten it. Whereas my sugar in my dough, it's actually meant almost as a moisture retaining agent, which the industrial ingredient label has another artificial in there. So instead of using sugar, cane sugar, in order to trap moisture in the dough, they're going to use a cheaper high fructose corn syrup and then a cheaper chemical agent that traps moisture in the dough. So now we have multiple ingredients doing what just pure sugar did. I can't believe that I'm saying that sugar is a healthier alternative to anything, but in real bread making, sugar's the way to go. You don't really want high fructose corn syrup in bread ever. You see that on a label, run away. And the sad thing is you go to the store and you'll see that on almost every label. So that's what you're dealing with the 15 ingredients. A lot of stuff you can't recognize. You should look at a bread label. It should be really short, really simple, and everything should be stuff that you've dealt with before yourself. A lot of people think that sourdough bread is a particular flavor, and I'd like to just correct that by saying that I can tease out so many different flavors out of sourdough products. I can achieve sweet, I can achieve pretty dang sour, we can achieve nuanced kind of nutty flavors through whole grains and whole wheats. And that's the point that sourdough is actually a method, not a flavor. So the way in which that the loaves of bread you find at your grocery store that are called sourdough are made, you take whatever 15 ingredients you want, and then at the very end you dump in lactic acid in a liquid form. It's not necessarily a living lactobacillus bacteria. It is just the liquid form of a derivative of the same thing that creates this intensely sour flavor that people have now associated with sourdough. But it's no different than the artificial cherry flavor in your cherry Coke. It's not really cherries in the same way, and if you eat a cherry whole, it doesn't come off the same way as the cherry flavored whatever it is that you ate. Sourdough bread's the same way. So I can make you a sourdough croissant, I can make you a sourdough English muffin, and you'll eat some of these things and you won't even realize that you're eating sourdough products. And that's the beauty of it. When we go to farmers markets, we don't label everything sourdough, but we're not shying away from the fact that everything actually is sourdough. We're trying to play this experiment game of trying to understand what the average person out there really knows when they encounter sourdough. And it's this constant education of Sourdough is not a flavor. Sourdough is a method. So no two sourdoughs are quite alike. No two fermentation sets in a bakery or in a home kitchen are quite alike. You can try to mimic somebody else's process, but your environment, your humidity, your culture itself is different. The resulting flavors are different. The temperatures that you work with will change the tartness at the end. So I can produce sourdough bread for you that you would never think is sourdough if your only experience was that artificially tart bread that you get at the store. I haven't found my own personal limitations for sourdough yet. As a bakery, we've said this is the only way that we want to bake. And I'm not trying to vilify yeast, so hear me right when I say that we're not some mortal enemies of the bakers out there that are baking with yeast. And there's certainly ways of baking traditionally with yeast that are time respected. We're breaking some tradition, I would say modern tradition, post 1850 tradition in the baking world. Sourdough croissants are not really a typical thing. When we bake with sourdough bread, we can make all the crusty loaves. We can add whatever we want to those crusty loaves, olives, cinnamon raisin, you name it, fruits, nuts. We made a pumpkin polenta loaf in the fall. With each season, we can do crazy things with the bread to introduce seasonal flavor. When we get into softer breads, you can make sandwich loaves. You can make all kinds of buns. So we like making burger buns as well as rolls. During the holidays, we'll produce tons and tons of dinner rolls that are just naturally leavened. On the pastry side, you can go cinnamon rolls, you can go croissant dough, all the variants within croissant dough, Queen Amands, baguettes. The list just goes on. I've really been studying a lot about rye bread lately. Rye takes its own sourdough starter with rye flour that we make, but there's huge amounts of baking traditions in rye breads as well, flat breads. We can go further and even venture into gluten-free baking. There's some incredible gluten-free baking happening from gluten-free sourdough starters that are made from rice flour or made from other grasses that are similar to wheat but don't have gluten in their genetic makeup. We believe that bread has this insane value in culture that forms sort of a bridge to other forms of local food. One of the main benefits that's come from our work in the last couple years is it's easier for people to approach our stand at a farmer's market and grab an artisan loaf of bread, go through the education of upgrading the type of bread they eat from store-bought to artisan bread, start getting croissants into their weekly treat. But it doesn't end there. We're really hoping that those same customers look around them and see the farmer at the stand behind us. So really we're hoping that bread and bread making is a conduit for people to understand the local food that's being grown around them, that's being produced around them. We also think that bread is an important part of our nutritional diets. With 80% historically of our diet coming from whole grains, we believe that there is a nutritious, good way of getting those whole grains from sourdough bread, and you don't need to compromise. There is a place in society for gluten-free, there's a place in society for grain-free, but that place is so much lesser than we have made it as a whole. You look at the gluten-free movement, you look at all these people that are advising not to eat grains, not to eat gluten. And my big question is why? Why is something that we were eating successfully for hundreds and hundreds of years, something that helped humans multiply around the entire planet and become the dominant species, now being this big evil? Well, we're trying to create an answer for that so that people can get back to eating bread. We believe that it's a really great thing to eat. It's a good use of our fields of wheat out there, and we believe that it has a place. I think that people are rediscovering and falling in love with baking at home because of the qualities of baking that bring you back in time to a completely different world that I think all of us intuitively miss. As humans, I don't think that we were programmed to sit in front of a screen all day, hunched over, typing. I think that we were given hands and feet and brains. Somebody recently made a comment to me about something about me being too intelligent for making bread, and I sort of scoffed that off. Because bread is hard work and requires intelligence to do really well. We need people who are intelligent across all the trades doing things. And I think that when people bake bread at home, they get a sense of fulfillment that comes from understanding this process that's difficult, that's likely resulting in their immediate failure at what they're trying to do. But something about the food aspect, something about the tactile aspect of doing something in your hands brings people back to try again. And then through that process of discovering this journey of bread making, you rediscover that this is a process of human life that has been around, that we have chosen to trade out for the convenience of going to the grocery store. So I think that what's really happening on the whole is people are rediscovering these things that we used to do as humans, and we used to do in community together, we used to share together. Breaking bread is a term because of the context. We break bread together in community, we share our work together, we have a good time together. And you know, whenever something is too easy, something else is traded off in that process. So I think the real core of your question boils down to, if I can go and grab an easy loaf of bread from the store and be back here within 10 minutes and be cutting it open, whatever, that's all nice, but there is something completely different to be had through the journey of making that loaf of bread. The key is to think about it as a journey and a starting point. And I think the first thing that anybody starting to bake bread at home should consider is to check themselves, to check how self-critical they are and whether they're actually up for the task of learning how to make bread. The type A personalities, and I probably fall into that somewhere along the line. I'm really constantly upset at my own work, wanting it to be better. You do have to balance that out a little bit to bake bread at home, enough to try again. The first takeaway is you're going to be trying over and over again, and there's going to be this trial and error process. The thing that's encouraging is, though, that your worst result is probably way better than the bread that you're buying at the store. It might not look as good, it might be harder to cut open or use in whatever way, but you're probably using better flour, you're probably using less junk in your bread recipe. So from the first loaf of bread you bake, even if it's under fermented, even if it's all the things that we don't like to look for in bread, it's still better bread than what you can find commercially available. So that alone should give you a whole lot of reason to go out and try making bread at home. But then other things to consider, find someone to follow, I would say. Find someone that you can sort of attach to their journey long enough that you can establish your own. Find some recipe that you can start as a starting point, but don't look at that recipe as this end-all be-all formula that you can never veer from. And then start to look at all of what you're doing and try to break it up into small components and measurable things. So even as the beginning novice bread baker at home, you can observe problems in your bread baking from day one. You can observe when things don't look right, even to you. And so you only know what you know in that given moment, and you have to start with what you know, correct what you know. Watch a video, watch a lot of videos, get the content you need, use that wisdom, and then check that knowledge against your own experience that you're facing when you're producing bread. Each day, make some change. It might be the wrong change, but you'll learn because your result will show you. And really just keep at it. If you keep at it long enough, you're going to be a bread baker, and it's going to become a part of your identity. The question is, do you want that to be a part of your identity? And you've got to then start figuring out how to piece it into your busy life. So when I make bread in the bakery, it can really consume my whole day. It's not a big deal because I'm making it for my living. In fact, there's other people here who are being supported financially from the bread we make. So our whole day is centered around bread. When I garden, I'm doing the gardening interval around the bread making. For you at home, you have to center bread making around your routine, and you can do that. So if you look at recipes and formulas that are incompatible, start asking questions of how can I make this work? You can look at things like no knead as a great way to start. That's a methodology of making sourdough bread that doesn't include kneading. It's sort of a 101 to modern bread making. We don't do a whole lot of kneading either. You've seen a lot of stretching and folding in our process. But no knead is this way of passively mixing bread the night before and being ready for shaping the next morning. It's an easy way to get a routine going at home. So you got to be looking for those ways to take our process and scale it into your own home kitchen. Dough hydration, for whatever reason, is just this like buzzy place to think about bread. If I talk to another baker, chances are within the first 5 or 6 minutes of talking to them, if I don't know them that well, one of us might ask each other, what's the hydration in your bread? Just like the thing that we talk about. But for whatever reason, this has become this phenomenon as like the end-all be-all of things to talk about in bread. And I gotta ask, why is it that big of a deal? Water does play a really significant role in dough. The more water we create in dough, the more dough mass, actually the more ionic activity in that dough. And so that sort of helps along fermentation in its own way. It has a scientific process. There's a reason that dough production has taken on more water as a whole over time. But I'd like to caution the home baker from getting too obsessed over the size of the holes in the artisan loaves that they're creating and refocus to the quality of the flour that's being used. That should be a much bigger discussion that doesn't happen. Are you buying flour from your local mill? Do you have a local mill where you are? Can you figure out if there's a stone mill nearby? Is there a way to encourage a local grain economy? The easiest way is just to buy whole grain flour from a small milling operation. So the mill that we're buying by the pallet from, just a few years ago, they were in the back of a kitchen restaurant starting this stone ground mill. They had revived this old brand, Hayden. Hayden was a 100-year-old flour mill that was competing with General Mills and some of the big name mills that are still around to this day. But competition sort of phased them out over time. That brand went away in 1999, but a local family bought it in 2011, went in the back of a restaurant and started milling on a rudimentary stone mill this whole grain flour. Well, if you roll the tapes forward from that year, now I think we're 8 or 9 years in, and they have this robust milling operation going in Queen Creek, and it's because of the support of bakeries like ours and even home bakers that have been buying their whole grains. You can find their whole grain flour at the local grocery store as well. Sprouts or other local grocers that focus on some local ingredients. Now, that's a good starting point. Take the flour choice and take care. We actually are making a blend of flour as well. We're trying to get that available for the market to purchase. If you buy local good flour, that's the foundation of good bread. It's not how much water you have in your dough. Also, when it comes to hydration, it's more about how much water the wheat that you're using can actually take on. And from strain and year of crop to strain and year of crop, there's variance in how much water the wheat can take in. So it's not a black and white equation of, oh, I need 85% hydration, or I need 75%, or I need 80. We happen to be about 80, which is still considered high hydration dough for our artisan loaves. But there's plenty of good bakers lower and higher than that, trying to achieve their own sets of result. Hydration is not the end-all be-all. Good solid grains and good fermentation really is where it's at. My entire experience from the time that I was in my late teens has been trying to make a living and then inevitably pursuing some passion project on the side. Right now, the passion project on the side is gardening, and I'm thrilled that there's a passion project that has turned into my living as well in baking bread. But if you go back to when I was 17, I was in tennis at the time, playing college level tennis. When I was 18, 19, right in high school, I got my first job waiting tables, and I took the money that I was making and bought a tennis stringer, started a little tennis stringing business on the side. That sort of led into working and teaching tennis formally at a club, but then on the side, I started coaching a high school team, actually as an 18-year-old. So I should have been in high school, but I had already gotten to college. I was a freshman in college, and I was coaching my old high school team. For the summer, I started a summer tennis camp, and that camp actually paid the bills for me at that time when I was 18 years old. And so I've sort of had a history of working for my living on the side, and then working for my living primarily, and then on the side starting some sort of project and trying to make money at that. As time progressed, I got a little bit better at making those side projects into mainstream things. This sort of was a double-edged sword for a little while. I was really passionate about coaching tennis, and I had started a pretty successful side gig coaching tennis. But then I got into mystery shopping, of all things. It was the side hustle for a little while that turned into a main hustle. I was doing video-based mystery shopping, and I'd started scaling it up. I was performing as an individual more video-based mystery shops than most video mystery shopping companies were doing through the use of smartphone technology and through the use of mobile uploading. So I'd looked at ways of taking what was happening in the marketplace, making them more efficient, and sort of kept improving. Same thing I do here. So really took every process that I was doing. In this case, it was going to a gas station, parking my car, going around the property, taking video footage and filling out a report. And month over month, shop over shop, I figured out how to shorten the time that it took to fill out that report, figured out how to shorten the time it took to upload that video to the cloud, and roll the tapes forward a few years. And we were actually building software for that goal of producing video from a smartphone for a mystery shop covertly. And I found myself in this just whole business of video mystery shopping, but I wasn't really into it. It was the side hustle that turned into the main hustle, had displaced teaching tennis, had displaced composting, had displaced all these things I was actually passionate about. And then I got divorced, and then I had an opportunity to run that business still, but a guy down the street who was running Proof all by himself was looking for help. And I remember seeing the ad for becoming a baking assistant for Proof. And I went to Amanda and I said, "Can I do this?" It was a entry-level job, and I had gotten way beyond entry level. I was running a business and supporting a household. I had kids already. I couldn't really afford the entry-level job, but it was tempting me. It was calling me somewhere in the background. A few months further passed. We showed up to a farmer's market on a Saturday morning one day to buy our Proof bread. See, we had just come back from Poland, and this is kind of the history of our bread relationship to begin with. The fact that I'm Polish of immigrant birth, Amanda's Lebanese of immigrant birth, but artisan sourdough was a big part of our experience because it was a part of my Polish background. So we found an artisan bakery, Proof, here in town, and we would go religiously to the Gilbert Farmers Market and pick up our Proof bread every single week. We had become those regular customers that the baker and the person selling for the baker knew at the market. So when we showed up that one Saturday morning, the day after returning from a trip to Poland, still jet lagged, wanting our staple grocery item for our house, our loaf of bread, we discovered that the bakery was going to cease to exist in short order, just 3 weeks. Jared was moving across the country, and so here we had this dilemma of a garage bakery that was going to cease to exist. I don't know, I just had this gut feeling that I needed to act. So that was Saturday. By the following Wednesday, I was waking up at 3 in the morning, rubbing my eyes, trying to figure out how to stay awake, and driving just down the street to another home in Mesa where Proof existed in a really early version of what we have today. Just one man, no mixers, no equipment, and he was doing his thing in there, producing for restaurants and for the one farmer's market. and I sought to take it over just 3 weeks later, learning all of this from him in a 3-week period. How do you take that and turn it into a viable business? I think all of what I had done up until that point had aided along the way, because it was not a viable business at that interval. It was sort of for Jared, but it was a viable business only to the point that he was burning out. So when we took Proof over, it was the type of thing that you had to wake up at 2 a.m. You didn't know what you were making that day because you had orders coming in via email. You sort of guessed the amount of sourdough starter to make the night before. And everything we were making was start to finish in a shift, ambient temperature, no cooling, no control over the dough. So we would mix, scale, bake, deliver every single day of the week, 7 days a week, at a much smaller volume. We could barely pay the bills to buy flour. There's certainly not enough revenue to support an employee, let alone a household, the ovens, all the utilities. So we started growing the thing while learning how to bake all at the same time. So we added a farmer's market just a couple months in. I was working on my own every single day, literally lived in the original garage. No AC to be had. The bathroom was across the house, so we were trekking flour. When I was done with work, we would be like putting in new electrical lines, just digging up the yard. There was no drain, there was no plumbing. All of this had to sort of be put in. So how do you make this into a business? You just grind and you lose sleep and you fight with your spouse daily as you push yourself to your nth degree. You make a lot of mistakes over and over again. In those beginning stages, half of the business was wholesale, restaurant accounts, and we were producing quite a bit of volume, like 150 ciabatta rolls on a daily basis. But we were selling those for such a small amount at the end of the day that it was barely paying for the time that it took. In fact, we did the math. We sat down and had this hard reality that the amount of money that we were selling our bread for, we were trying to compete with industrial scale bakeries who are also selling to restaurants, and we just couldn't do it. So at the end of the day, we couldn't put an employee in to make that bread for a profit. If we just paid the employee, we'd lose money. So we had to really face this hard reality of, is wholesale for us at this stage? So we got out of all the restaurant work for a little while and just focused on farmers markets, focused on creativity, focused on honing our craft. We started adding a third market when we got rid of the wholesale. Every market was just an insane change around here. So we went from a situation where I took this over on my own and I was working 16, 20-hour days. By a few months into this, we were running 24-hour days, 7 days a week. So you couldn't even really get a good night's sleep ever. I would retreat to my bedroom, which bordered a wall with the bathroom that bakers were using, and we had to keep our old oven that could only do 8 loaves at a time fed 24 hours a day to keep the bread rolling. So turning this into a business was just a slow haul of changing everything out over time. Every process, every ingredient, every bit of timing ritual. We had to gain more control over every process. We could no longer do a guessing game of waking up and learning then how much bread we were gonna make for that day. We had to figure out how to plan everything, organize everything, and turn this into something that was more systematic and controlled. It took time. It was painful and rewarding at the same time. The feedback that we were getting back then, so many thankful people for this amazing bread that we're bringing to other parts of the valley for the first time. See, when we entered the farmers markets, the other bread producers who had predated us had already sort of industrialized their processes. So we're competing with other bread companies at the market level that had been around for a couple decades. And their operations had grown into multi-million-dollar operations, but there was no other void for the farmers market. So we're competing against these square boxy loaves that were just coming from a more local industrial factory instead of from something like this, just a garage and a bunch of passionate people making bread and really caring about the end result. So it was hard in the sense that there was so many finances involved. There's so much planning involved. You know, we didn't have the right equipment. You look at the space, and we have the several hundred forms, the bannetons with which to put bread once it's been shaped. When we first bought the bakery, we had maybe 30 of those. So our upper limit on a daily basis was 30, 40 loaves, that's it. There was only a few of the couches, there was only a few of the fermentation bins. Our oven was awful. We didn't have any ingredients for rolling flour into, really nothing, just bare bones. Think of the most artistic person you've ever met, and you would meet the original owner of Proof. Just like this eccentric chef baker that was willing to go through this self-sacrificial beating up of oneself and burning out of oneself for years and years to gain the base traction that Proof needed to take off. We sort of took it off with the right set of experiences leading up, but Jared did a lot of the heavy lifting, creating a brand, creating kind of a seed that we then watered and took care of and refined and made a little bit more effective for a business. We're really passionate about growing our own food, and I think that this passion predates the bakery. It sort of goes back into my own rabbit hole discovery online and into understanding the type of adult life that I want to live. I think I have to go all the way back to my mid-20s as I was sort of discovering my roots culturally. Again, immigrant family, a lot of home cooking. Amanda as well, immigrant family, a lot of home cooking. So we grew up here in the US, we grew up amongst our peers, we grew up amongst the industrial convenience, the global food production. We grew up amongst all the fast food, all the restaurant culture and all that's a lot of fun. But something was calling us back to our roots, both of us, just with a lot of intensity. And so as we got into the kitchen, learned how to cook, learned how to use our family recipes, that sort of lent itself to wondering what the quality of the ingredients that we're buying is. My previous business was grocery mystery shopping. We ended up sort of carving out a niche for ourselves in grocery, so I worked with local grocery brands and saw the stuff that was on the shelves and noticed that there's really not a whole lot of difference between the quality of the produce in the high-end grocery stores and the budget grocery stores. In fact, there are brands out there, grocery brands, that have the same exact distribution centers catering to the rich on the one end and catering to the poor on the other end. And they change the branding of the grocery store, they change the layout, they change the wood fixtures that house those produce items, but all the produce is just being brought in from way far away, and it's all been irradiated and all that, and really not all that great for us. So growing our own food is a response to that. There's this incredible farmer out there, Joel Salatin, that has made a huge impact on the global community through his books and YouTube and other teaching. He believes in permaculture and in this farming practice where everything is sort of recycled on property. He influenced me a lot in the early years through a book called Folks, This Ain't Normal. It's just sort of like a cultural view of everything that was historically normal and how it's done today and how it makes no sense. A lot of discussion on producing food at the residential level that we can produce, that our farmers can produce the staple crops that we don't have the space for. So we don't have the space on this property to produce wheat. We don't have the space to produce all these like major staple crops, sugarcane, whatnot. We do have plenty of space for tomatoes, produce, and all of that. We could easily feed our family. We can feed our bakery, which means we can feed all of our customers with all the specials that we produce through just the third of an acre that we have here. It's plenty of space. And so I think we're producing local food to learn and to graduate. We're hoping for an adult life where we have a relationship with the land that we own, and that land is productive and doing something for us as opposed to just being an artificial landscape of astroturf for us to look at that's pretty. We want to really have that relationship with the land. I really hope that more people venture out of their homes, probably on a Saturday morning. If they're living in a winter climate, spring, summer is the time. If you're living in a climate that's really nice all year, you can go all year. There are farmers markets here in the valley in Phoenix happening in the 120-degree heat in the summer. But just by going out to the market and deciding to look at the farmer's market from a different lens, take off the grocery store lens, the perception of price that you have, and start to understand that when you buy locally, you're not just buying for the low price point, you're buying to gain a relationship with the producer of that food. You might end up paying $1 or $2, whatever more per pound for that produce or for that bread, but that person who's selling you that food is going to start to recognize you. You're going to start to build this interesting relationship where you're heard, your wants and desires are appreciated by the person who's producing the food behind the scenes. In fact, we're going to probably obsess over the feedback you give us. And the thing is that industrial food producer does not care about you. They don't care about me. They just care about the bread or whatever it is they're producing moving off the shelves fast enough at the grocery store. You can sort of make a huge impact in your local food economy when you choose to enable people to grow and produce food locally through businesses like this.